Also, as a reminder, for more Microsoft webcasts, you can visit microsoft.com/webcasts. And again, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's TechNet webcast, Secure, Simplified Web Publishing Using Internet Information Services 7.0. And now, without any further delay, I'm going to turn today's session over to our presenter, Robert McMurray.
Thanks very much. And so, as Tracy just said, my name is Robert McMurray, and I'm a program manager on the IIS product team. Specifically, I focus on the web publishing technologies, meaning that I'm over everything that we were going to cover today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to cover today. So our objectives for this session is so that you can understand the direction that we're taking with web publishing for Microsoft's Internet Information Services. So we're going to go through and look at features of the new FTP service today. We'll talk about our plans for the front page server extensions. And then lastly, we'll take a look at the new WebDAV modules that we're putting into IIS 7. The one thing to think about through all this is that Microsoft is trying to make web publishing easier and more powerful in IIS 7 than it has been in the past. Some of the things that would help if you knew ahead of time, just from a familiarization point of view, is file transfer protocol and the FTP servers that we've put out in the past. A little bit of knowledge of the front page server extensions wouldn't hurt. And then lastly, any familiarization with WebDAV. So just as a brief agenda, the way that we've organized today's webcast is we're going to do a very short publishing overview for IIS 7. Then, as I mentioned before, we're going to go through the FTP 7 features with a lot of demos so we can see a lot of these features in action. Next, we'll talk about the front page server extensions that we're putting out for both Windows Server 2008 and Windows Vista. And then lastly, we'll take a quick look at WebDAV. So when talking about web publishing in IIS in the past, we've usually broken that down to one of these three technologies, FTP, FPSE, and WebDAV, which are the ones that we're covering today. Now, there were other ways of actually delivering content to a server. I myself have written things like posting acceptor type pages using ASP or ASP.NET. There was actually a time when IIS was shipping a posting acceptor ISAPI extension. But these were always rather special purposed means of delivering content to a server. You were uploading a file here or a file there, or if you were hosting a site for someone else, then this was a way that they could upload their images or something like that. So those are more file upload technologies as opposed to full-fledged web publishing technologies, which is where you've got something like a development environment and a production environment, and you're going to publish everything from that source server over to the destination server to make the site go live. And for that, you really do need a little bit more rich of a feature set in order to deliver that functionality. So in the previous versions of IIS, we've had these different publishing technologies. But when you look at FTP as it's been in IIS for a while, it really hasn't had that many updates since IIS 4. Most people have been around IIS for the past several years, so they could probably notice this. So with IIS 4, we made a huge departure from the way that we had done FTP in the past, like with IIS 3 and before. But with the exception of things like user isolation that came out with IIS 6, there really haven't been a lot of product updates in that realm. Front page server extensions was actually subject to external product life cycles. The front page server extensions came out of the Office group here at Microsoft, and so because of that, there were different ship schedules, there were different end-of-life schedules, and lastly, WebDAV was actually done by an external group from the IIS product group as well, and so therefore it had design requirements that were geared around things like Microsoft Exchange. So with IIS 7, all of that changes because we've brought all of these products in-house to the IIS product team. So one thing to keep in mind is we're going to ship all of these for Windows Server 2008. We'll be shipping our FTP service. The version of the front page server extensions that we're going to ship is just a feature-compatible version of the front page server extensions that have been around in the past. We are doing a brand new WebDAV implementation that's been designed from the ground up, and all of these will be available as downloads currently from the IIS.net website. So right now you could actually go out to the IIS.net website and download the new version, or at least the beta versions for the FTP service that we've put out and for the front page server extension. The WebDAV implementation that we put out should be coming out in a public beta by the end of the year. So jumping into our discussion, when you take a look at the way that FTP7 works, the way that FTP works in IIS 6 and earlier, IIS administrators have always needed to create two sites in the past. And the reason being is because HTTP and FTP sites stored their settings separately. If anyone was familiar with the way the metabase worked, there were setting areas for the FTP service and separate settings for the W3 service. And these did not share any settings. Well, in IIS 7, the new FTP7 server integrates fully so that actually a site is a single manageable object that can be hosting both HTTP and FTP content at the same time. So rather than just talk to that point, I'd rather pull it up and actually show you a demo here. So the two things that we're going to take a look at are adding FTP publishing to an existing website and then adding a new FTP site. So if I switch to my virtual machine here, I need to log in here quickly. And let me open up my Internet Services Manager. And for those of you that are new to IIS 7, the user interface has dramatically changed. So when you start off, you have a start page, and you can actually pull up the settings for your entire server. So instead of having to right-click on your machine and go to Properties, you now have all these individual feature settings. And you'll notice in here I have all of my FTP feature settings because I've installed the new FTP service. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go down and I'm going to take a look at my default website. Now if I were to bring up the bindings for my default website, right now you'll notice that I have just an HTTP binding in here. If I wanted to, I could click Add, and I can actually specify that I want to add an FTP binding to this existing website. And this is pretty simple. The one thing about that, though, is this only adds the ability to have FTP publishing on this site. You'd still need to go add additional settings like authorization rules and authentication settings. So instead of doing that, one of the best ways is to come down here and click Add FTP Publishing. And when you click this, it launches a wizard that will actually go through and start helping you configure all of these settings at one time. So in here you get to change your binding settings for IP address and your port and virtual host. And I'm going to skip virtual host because we're going to talk about that later. And I'm also going to skip SSL because we're going to talk about that later. I'm going to go ahead and click Next. And since this is actually my default website, I'm going to go ahead and enable basic authentication and say I want to enable access for a specific user. And because I know I'm going to be on localhost, I'm going to go ahead and say that my administrator can do read and write. So when I say Finish Now, it gives me this little dialog that says that I need to refresh the page for changes to be recognized. So if I hit F5, all of my FTP icons magically appear in here. And just taking a look at some of the settings that this did for me. First of all, going back to my bindings dialog, you notice it added my FTP binding for me automatically. Then under my authentication settings, it added basic authentication as being enabled. And when we take a look at authorization rules, it added an authorization rule for my administrator account. So if I were to open up a command prompt now and just type FTP localhost, it's going to come up and prompt me for a user. I can say administrator, enter my password, and I can do a directory listing, and it shows me my files. So pretty straightforward. Let me log out of there. So that's the way that you can add FTP publishing to an existing website. Once you've done so, you can actually turn right around and say you want to remove FTP publishing, and it does the inverse. So if I click this link in here to say remove FTP publishing, it's going to prompt me to make sure that I want to do that. I'll go ahead and say yes, and it tells me I need to refresh again. I do so. All of my FTP settings are gone, and I no longer have web publishing on that site. This leaves me the ability to come in here now and say that I want to add a new FTP site. So I'm going to start up this wizard here to add a new FTP site. And in here I can name my site, so I'm just going to call it my FTP site. I'm going to go ahead and point that to my inetpub FTP root directory, which is not created by default, unlike in the past. I went ahead and I created that before doing this demonstration. So I'm going to go ahead and say next, and because I know I don't have anything else on port 21 all unassigned, I can go ahead and just leave those settings for the binding. Once again, I'm going to skip SSL. I'm going to click next, and this time let's just say that I was creating a publicly browsable FTP site. So I'm going to add a rule this time for anonymous users to just have read access. So when I apply that, it brings up my site here, and notice I have my different settings in here for FTP authentication, authorization. If I were to take a look at these, you'll notice the rules were added appropriately for authentication and authorization. And under my bindings, I just have my single binding added. If I were to log into my box now, I can log in anonymously and do a directory listing, and notice that you don't see anything in there right now, except this temp directory that I had created in there earlier. So that's it for creating a new FTP site. Pretty straightforward. It actually launches the same wizard as we do for the add FTP publishing to a site. It just gives you the additional page of being able to name the site and pick the home directory. So switching back to the presentation, to recap the things that we just saw, you saw me add FTP publishing to an existing website, and this shows off our integration with a site at this point, where you have both HTTP and FTP being served off the same site. This is much easier from an administrator perspective, because it means that the administrator can just add a single site and add both HTTP and FTP settings to it, and then that way people can author their content and end users can browse to that. And then I also showed you how to add a new FTP publishing site. So next, let's talk about some hosting improvements. The next several slides and demos that we're going to go through are specifically targeted at trying to make things easier from a hosting perspective. So first of all, what we've done is we've taken a look at what's the current scenario that you have inside FTP versus HTTP with hostname sites. So in IIS 6 and earlier, hosting multiple FTP sites required unique IP addresses for every site. And the reason for this is the FTP protocol does not actually support something like HTTP's host headers. So in the case of HTTP, you have this one header where you can specify a host name that gets sent in the HTTP packet that goes across that identifies which specific host on a server you need to talk to. Well, currently FTP doesn't have a way of doing that. There is actually an IETF draft that we've filed that will get a host command added, but in the meantime, we needed a way where we could differentiate sites to allow hosting multiple FTP sites off the same server. And so what we've done is we've introduced virtual host support. And we'll go ahead and do a demonstration now to show actually how that works. So switching back to my virtual PC, I have my default website and my FTP site here. But what I want to do is I want to go ahead and add a couple new FTP sites in here. So I'm going to say add FTP site, and I'm going to go ahead and say I want to add one for contoso.com and point it to my content directory, Contoso. And in this particular case, I'm going to go ahead and put in the host name. And I'm going to skip SSL, and I'm going to say next. Now this is going to be a site that's going to be for hosting content, so I'm going to go ahead and enable basic, and I'm going to go ahead and add my specified user. And I'm just going to recycle my administrator account here, because I'm the one who's going to be doing all the authoring in this case. So I'll turn on my read and write permissions, and I'll say finish. And that just gives me the one site. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and add a second FTP site. And I'm going to make this my Fabricam site. And I'm going to add the Fabricam path and add the host name for that and skip SSL. I'm going to add basic. I'm going to add a particular user, in this case my administrator account again, and I'm going to go ahead and say finish. And at this point, it's telling me that it doesn't know the status actually for the FTP service at this point, and I know that the service is running in the background, so I'm not going to worry about that. So if I disconnect and I go ahead and I connect here to Fabricam. Now the binding in this case, I've gone ahead and I've just added a host entry so I can have that information here. But the way that we work with virtual hosts is you actually take this part of the information here and you use it kind of like you would use a domain login if you were logging into a Windows box. With the exception of instead of using a backslash, you'd use the pipe command and then the user that you're logging into. And it will prompt me for my password. Now when I do a directory listing, you'll notice it tells me in here that I'm in the Fabricam website because I put this text file in there saying that it's Fabricam. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and disconnect, and I'm going to go ahead and connect to the Contoso site. And once again, I'm going to copy this logon information. And I've logged in, and when I do my directory listing, you notice it now says that I'm in the Contoso. So one of the things to keep in mind here is FTP is never actually passing the name of the host, unlike HTTP, which passes it in that particular host header. So you do need to actually pass the host name as part of your login information. So like I said, this is much like when you're working with a domain account, where you would say your domain name / username. It's the same sort of idea. The great thing about this is you can actually FTP to any site and then use that actual path. So I can say FTP to localhost in this case, and when I go to log in, if I say that I want to log into Contoso using this method, I can log in with my password. And when I do a directory listing, you'll notice it actually puts me into Contoso. So the real world scenario that you would think about doing here would be if you were hosting content for, let's say, 10 different customers. What you would do then is you could go ahead and say, ftp.myserver.com to point people to the FTP location for your server. When they go to log in, they would actually specify the host name as part of their login credentials, and then that will send them to the appropriate FTP site. So it's almost a way of kind of like a user isolation, but being done with the host name as the delimiter for it. So in reality, this is kind of the same way that HTTP works, except we're doing it in a different method by using it as part of the username, but we are just giving a way of passing over the virtual host that you want to talk to as part of the login information. Now, our FTP service actually does support passing a true host command. So if you had an FTP client that was capable of sending custom commands, you can actually say the name host as part of your login information. So if I were to disconnect and go to log in, if I use the quote command from the command line FTP and say host and pass a host name, now I can log in with administrator and my password. And notice I'm actually in the Contoso site, because up here I actually specified the true host name using the host command. Let me go ahead and disconnect from my FTP session there. And let me go ahead and switch back to presentation. So what you've just seen a demonstration of is how to add host names to FTP sites, and how to do that binding, how users can actually log in using our virtual host support. And I also went ahead and showed you how you can log in using the true host command if you have a client that knows how to send the command. Oops. Sorry about that, I jumped presentations there. So the next hosting improvement we'd like to take a look at is user isolation. So when we look at user isolation IIS-6, which is where it was first introduced, it required physical directories in order to do the isolation by user account. And the reason for this is the infrastructure just did not support virtual directories at this point. So what we've done in IIS-7 is we've expanded the feature set for user isolation to allow virtual directories mixed with physical directories, and we've added some other cool features. And so what I'd like to do at this point is actually show you a quick demo of how user isolation works in IIS-7 with the new FTP7 server. So if I switch back to my site here, and let me just do a quick refresh so I can pull up the status on my FTP sites, and notice I see them all running there. If I go to this FTP site that I created a little while ago, I'm going to bring up my user isolation settings. So we have several different choices here. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the way user isolation worked in IIS-6, in IIS-6 you had only had 3 settings. The first setting that you had was no user isolation. Then you had kind of like a basic user isolation, and then you had an AD mode for user isolation. And the AD mode required you to actually go out and add custom settings to your users in Active Directory that pointed to where their FTP root and what their logon directory were going to be. An interesting little behavior that came out of saying that you weren't going to use user isolation in IIS-6 and earlier is that when you said no user isolation, if you had a directory named off of a particular user account, when they logged in with that user account, you would actually be dropped in the directory by that user's name. So if you had a user named Robert in this case, and Robert logged in using his credentials, he would be dropped in that directory, but he could always change directory back to the root. But what we've done in IIS-7 here is we've actually separated that out. So if you notice, the first two choices in here are to not isolate users, and you will start the user in either the FTP root directory or the username directory. So when you say the FTP root directory, that behavior from IIS-6 is totally gone. When you log in with your credentials, you will just always be dropped in the root of the FTP site, wherever that may be, and it'll perform no redirection off the username. Whereas the second choice, when you log in with a credential and you have a folder by that user's name, then that's where the user will start their session at. So we've kept it there for backwards compatibility. You don't have to turn it on. You can actually have people drop directly in the root. Then the next settings that we have are, we have 2 different settings for username directories, and lastly we have the FTP home directory configured in Active Directory. Now that setting works the exact same way that it did in IIS-6. So all the scripts that people may have written to set home directories up in Active Directory, those will all work with IIS-7, so you can still configure that way. As far as using the 2 different choices here for username directories, the first choice in here is user isolation the same way that we did things in IIS-6, meaning that you need to create a hierarchy of physical directories, and actually that's the second choice here, is the username physical directory. So this is the IIS-6 mode, and when you're in this mode, it will actually enable global directories. So meaning that if you turn on user isolation using this mode and you have a directory off the root, let's say that's a script library, all users, whenever they log in, will be able to change directory into that global virtual directory. And this other setting, where it just says username directory, this is the setting where now you can actually use virtual directories to create your hierarchy for users. But this disables global virtual directories, and it's because the infrastructure changes in between the two. And in order to accommodate virtual directories, we're disabling global virtual directories, which actually is a little tighter from a security perspective anyways. Because now this means that for any user to have a particular virtual directory, you have to go physically create it for that user. So since the username physical directory works the same way it did in IIS-6, I'm just going to demonstrate the new method in here using the username directory. So when we take a look at our site here, I have this physical folder off the root, which we won't actually be seeing once we start logging in using virtual directory. And what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to, first of all, apply my setting in here to turn on user isolation. And actually, if I tried to log in at this point, just using localhost, administrator. Actually, I think I only have FTP enabled. And if I try to log in, it's going to come right back and tell me home directory inaccessible. So I'm actually going to change the mode for this site. So I'm going to disable anonymous. I'm going to say I want to make this an actual login site for users. So I'm going to enable basic authentication. I'm going to go to my authorization rules. I'm going to remove the rule for anonymous. And I'm going to add an allow rule for the administrator. And I'm going to turn on read and write access. Now I'm going to add a virtual directory, and I'm going to call this local user because that is the root path that I need to create to start creating my per user directories under. Now, to show a little level of delineation here, you need to tell IIS where the path is to start using user accounts. So when it is a local user, like I'm using for my local administrator account, you'll use this local user path, same way that you did in IIS 6. But if you were working with a domain account, then you would actually put the domain name in here. So instead of saying local user, I could have said domain name in here, and then my users would be pulled from that particular domain. So you can add multiple different domains in here if you've got a multi-domain setup, but in this particular case, I'm going to go ahead and move everything back to local user. Now the physical path that you point to for this root directory is kind of up to you because no one should ever actually see it. So what I typically do as a rule of thumb is I point it right back to the root of the site. Now let me explain what I mean by no one should ever see it. Once you start logging in using user isolation, the users are actually going to be dropped into a directory below this level. So no one should be getting into the root of your site because you've got user isolation turned on. No one should be going into the directory where it's saying that the account needs to be found because that's just a hierarchical level that you use to delineate where the user accounts are coming from. So no one should ever be going into this path. So I'll go ahead and accept that. Now what I can actually do is I can come back and I can say I want to add a virtual directory underneath here, and I want to add one for administrator. And in this particular case, let's go ahead and let's point to my www root folder. So when my administrator account logs in, he should be dropped in www root. Okay, so now I have my full hierarchy expanded throughout there. So now when I try to log in, let me disconnect. I'm going to put administrator, enter my password. And when I do a directory listing, you'll notice that I see all my content from the root of my www root site. Now one thing further in here that you can do, and this is what I think is a little more useful. I'm going to go back to my site and I'm going to go to my directory browsing options. And one of the things that you can do in this version is you can turn on the ability to view virtual directories. So in the past, in IIS 6 and earlier, if you had virtual directories, they would never show up in your users' directory listings. So in FTP 7, it's an option where you can actually turn this on. So I'm going to go ahead and apply this. And I'm going to go back to my administrator account. I'm going to add another virtual directory. So let's say my administrator account is being used to manage some other websites. So I'm going to create the Contoso path, and I'm going to go ahead and point it to the Contoso physical directory. And now I'm going to go ahead and add another virtual directory. Let's do it to the example.com this time. And let's go to that setting. And now that I've added that, when I log in, when I do a directory listing now, you notice both of these sites under here. So a great thing that you can do now in FTP 7 is you can turn on user isolation. You can say that you want to use virtual directories to organize your user accounts. And then you can turn on the ability to view virtual directories. And when that user logs in, you can have virtual directories that point to every site that you're hosting for them. So let's say you've got a web author that's hosting a dozen different websites on your box. You would create a virtual directory for each of their websites under their user isolation directory. So when they log in, they can just immediately CD into that directory and edit all their files. So the great thing here is if they have multiple people that are all going to be working on the same site, you just create a virtual directory for each user that points to that. So user 1 could be pointing to 5 sites, and user 2 could be pointing to 3 sites, and 2 of those are shared with user 1. You can just create this hierarchy of virtual directories that sets all that up for you. So let me go ahead and disconnect from my FTP session here, and we'll switch back over to presentation. So what we've just done is we've taken a quick look at user isolation and the way that we've changed it in FTP7. Specifically, I showed how now you can create your hierarchies completely out of virtual directories, which makes it much easier to manage. And of course, you can point those virtual directories local content, UNC-based content, and you're not limited by sticking everything under a particular physical folder structure. And it's also extremely helpful because you can turn on the ability to view virtual directories. And when people log in with user isolation, you can point them at their different content areas so that they can author all their different websites from their single user isolation route. So next, let's talk about disk quotas, which is another hosting improvement. Now, one of the things that people have asked from our FTP service for a while is the ability to limit the disk usage for FTP sites. And we haven't supported quotas. So coming forward into FTP7, we looked real early on at actually adding native quota support. But starting with Windows Server 2003 R2 and into Windows Server 2008, they have this great file server resource manager built in that it's an optional installation component that has just wonderful directory quota support. So rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, we just decided that we would go ahead and integrate with that. So what I'd like to go do at this point is actually show you a quick demonstration of how directory quotas work using the File Server Resource Manager and how you can see this information manifested to you inside FTP. So what we're going to do at this point is I'm going to go back to my Internet Service Manager. I go back to my site, and I'm going to leave all my settings I have there for all of my user isolation. But I am going to make one quick change in here. I'm going to go to my directory browsing options, and there is a choice in here to show available bytes. So by turning this on, this means that the directory-related commands are going to go ahead and give me back a listing of how many bytes I have remaining.
Robert, I'm going to interrupt you for just a moment. We need you to go into your sharing.
Okay.
Looks like we're still in the demo slide.
Okay.
There we go.
Relaunch that. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for catching that. For some reason, it just didn't register. So let me go ahead and actually show you where I did these settings again. So what I did is I went to my directory browsing options. And when I opened that, I chose to show available bytes. And as I mentioned just a second ago, this means that directory-related commands will actually come back and tell us how many bytes we have free. So if I log in right now using my administrator account, and notice it came right up and it told me that I have 4 gigabytes of, a little bit more than 4 gigabytes of disk space available. And of course, if I do a directory listing, it comes up and it gives me that information again. If I now go to the File Server Resource Manager, which I've installed on this box, when it comes up, it's going to show me this user interface. And under quota management right now, I have no quotas except the soft quota that is installed on my C drive by default. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to say that I want to create a quota. And it's going to ask me for the path. So I'm going to go ahead and put in, let's do www.contoso.com. And it has several templates for you to choose from at the beginning, 100 megabyte limit, 200 megabyte. I'm going to go ahead and say that I just want to create a custom quota at this point just so I can show off a little bit more of the features. So this will come up and it'll ask me what things I want to put in here. So I'm going to say I want to do something, fairly small. Let's just say a 20 megabyte quota in here. So we have choices for hard quota, do not allow users to exceed, or soft quota, where the user can exceed their limit, but you'll actually get notifications back on it. And there's all sorts of notifications that you can actually add inside here, sending email to various users, etc. And there are so many features in here, I really can't demonstrate it all right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip doing any sort of a notification threshold, and I'm just going to go ahead and approve that right now. So I'm going to create that, and it's asking me if I want to save this as a template. I'm going to go ahead and just say I want to use it without creating a template. And so notice in here now, it tells me that I have this quota on the Contoso path, and it tells me that it's a hard quota, meaning that I can't actually exceed that. So if I now switch back to FTP, and I go to log in again, and enter my password, notice when I do my directory listing, it still tells me that I have 4 gigabytes of disk space available. If I switch to www.contoso.com and I do a directory listing, notice now my bytes remaining has dropped down to that 20 megabytes that I specified. But if I CD back to the root and CD into the example path, I need an extra W there, and I do a directory listing, it still shows me that I have that 4 gigabytes worth of space. That's because I didn't add a quota to the example path. I only added it to the Contoso path. So what this means is that an administrator can come in now and they can start setting up quotas for each of their different content areas. And you can have different quotas for each content area. You can save your own templates so that if you've got a user that's paying for 50 megabytes worth of storage or another user that's paying 100 megabytes worth of storage, you can just save these templates out, and along with those templates can be all your settings like the email notification for who should get emailed when a threshold is crossed, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very powerful feature, and our integration with that is simply the ability of being able to show you your different bytes remaining depending on which path that you're logging into. So it's a really great feature in Windows Server 2008. And once again, just to recap what we took a look at, we just took a quick look at our integration with disk quotas as presented to you by the File Server Resource Manager. So taking a look at security and new Internet standards, if you take a look at the FTP service in IIS 6, and earlier, these versions of the FTP service did not support new features like SSL or IPv6 or UTF-8, and simply they just weren't implemented in the past. So in FTP 7, we support FTP over SSL, which is FTPS, IPv6, and UTF-8. So we support all these features. And what I'd like to do at this point is actually talk to the abbreviation FTPS, because there's a lot of confusion that comes up with that. There are two different ways of doing secure FTP. There is FTP over SSL, which is FTPS, and then there's also FTP using SSH, which is SFTP. Now our implementation is the FTP over SSL, which is implemented in requests for comments on the Internet. And the reason why we're going with that is because Microsoft does not actually have an SSH implementation. And so therefore, if Microsoft shipped an SSH implementation, we could make our FTP server support SFTP, but until such time as they would do something like that, we simply can't support that because we're not going to ship a whole SSH implementation with the FTP service. So we support FTPS, which all of the clients that we've been testing with out there, all the third-party FTP clients, all support FTPS as well as SFTP. So without further ado, what I'd like to actually do now is demonstrate using FTP over SSL. So if I switch back to my computer here, let me minimize this command prompt. And I can go ahead and just minimize the File Server Resource Manager. We can leave that quota there. So I still have all my user isolation settings set up. And what I'd like to do now is go back to the root of my FTP site. And if I go to my SSL settings, notice that it just says that I'm going to allow SSL connection. Now, SSL works with FTP a little different than it works with HTTP. In HTTP, to switch to HTTPS, you actually create a separate binding that is SSL enabled. So you actually have a website that's listening to, let's say, www.contoso.com on port 80 with a host header, and then you add an SSL binding. So now it's actually going to start listening to port 443 off your machine's IP address. With FTP, it works a little differently. So if you want to disable SSL altogether, simply don't select a certificate. So the moment that you say that you want to choose a certificate, and if I use this drop-down up here, it shows that I have this FTP SSL certificate that I created before today's webcast. I can go ahead and choose that. And when I say that I want to apply this, what this means now is that my server will allow me to start using SSL if I so choose. So it works differently in FTP in that you make the connection and then you can turn SSL on or off. So instead of using the command line FTP tool at this point, I'm going to use another command line tool that we're going to release. It's called FTPS. And the reason why we have this is the command line FTP that ships with Windows Server 2008 does not actually support SSL-related commands. So we have this other tool, FTPS, that does. So when I tell it that I want to connect to localhost, it will ask me for my credentials. I'm going to go ahead and log in. Now at this point I've logged in and there's nothing really amazing about that. But if I tell it that I want to switch to SSL, what it just did here, it just came back, the server responded and told me that I actually negotiated switching to SSL. So I did this over the exact same command channel that I did. So instead of listening to a different port like you do with HTTP and HTTPS, you just switch to SSL on your FTP channel. What I'm going to do here at this point is I'm going to change things, and I'm going to switch over to my box, and I'm going to say that I want to require SSL connections. So I'm going to apply that. Then I'm going to switch back to my command prompt, and I'm going to try to log in again. It's going to ask me for my username. And it comes right up and it tells me access is denied, and the error details is saying that the SSL policy requires SSL for the control channel. Now, one thing that I haven't been pointing out as we've been going along, although I've been showing you the messages that come back, is in our new FTP server, we have these detailed error messages that will actually get returned when you're working on the local client. These are an option, and you can turn this feature off, but they're really, really great for troubleshooting situations. So if I had created an FTP site and I went to log in and I had forgotten that I had made my policy to require SSL, the error message that you would see returned would be a little bit more cryptic. And I'll actually show you what I mean by that. So let me go to my FTP messages. And in here we have this choice for show detailed error messages for local requests, which is on my default. Let me apply that. And let me go ahead and try to log in again. And I just get this very short error message coming back saying policy requires SSL. And that's as much as I get back. So it's a very handy feature to have turned on. I'm going to go ahead and re-enable that. And we'll go back to our SSL setting. And if I actually now tell it that I want to disconnect, I can use a -p command from FTPS. And this will drop me directly into SSL. And I can say administrator and specify my password. And now it lets me log in directly using SSL the whole time. So in this particular case, I used an SSL certificate that I created using the self-signed certificate creation feature that we have in IIS 7. If you were logging into a FTP server across the internet that had created a self-signed certificate, you would actually be prompted when you made your certificate negotiation to accept the certificate. So it would actually prompt you as part of this login process saying, do you want to continue, yes or no? So I'm going to go ahead and disconnect at this point and show some of the other neat features that you can do with our SSL settings. You can come down here for custom, and you can actually specify what your SSL encryption policy is for your different channels. So for your control channel, you can say, I want to require SSL just for credentials, and then for your data channel, I want to allow that. So what this means is you would make sure by saying you want to require only for credentials that your username and password will always be encrypted using SSL when going across the internet, and then you allow the client to decide whether or not they want to send their data encrypted. So a client could connect and then pass their credentials using SSL, and then the moment they've done that, they can actually drop back to non-SSL for the rest of their communication. So we'll go ahead and take a quick look at that. So if I connect to my site again, I'm going to use the -P switch once again to automatically connect using SSL. I'll connect with my administrator account, enter my password. Now I've logged in, and let's see, oh, it gave me a SSL policy for data channel. Oh, you know what? I just realized I didn't apply that. So once again, you see a wonderful example of what happens when you have your your detailed error messages turned on. So telling me that I should have left that on. So let me go ahead and make a quick reconnection. Enter my password. I do a directory listing, and hang on a second here. It's giving me a quick error. So let me go ahead and just reconnect on that. And so, giving me an error right now based on the extended passive mode. So I'm going to go ahead and just bypass that for now. But the last choice that we have down in here is the requiring 128-bit encryption for SSL connections. So if you want to force a stronger level of SSL, you can go ahead and do that. What I'm actually going to do with my site now is I'm just going to go ahead and switch it back to just allowing SSL connections. And that leaves it back to the client to go ahead and make the connection. So let me switch back to my presentation. And once again, we did a quick demo where I showed using secure publishing, using FTP over SSL. And once again, as I mentioned, you can do this from any one of the third-party FTP clients that are out there. We've tested with about a dozen different clients here, going ahead and establishing the connections and toggling SSL on and off. So it's very feature-rich. You saw me using it in conjunction with our user isolation, so it works in that mode as well. So the next feature that we have is extensibility. So in the past, we haven't been able to extend any of the functionality for the FTP server because we didn't have any extensibility points for it. But in FTP 7, we're extending these different features. We're extending the extensibility, the role support, home directory lookups, custom commands, and some logging. So in the case of home directory lookups, in the past, we only did custom home directory lookups based on the AD mode, but now you can actually write your own module that plugs in, and you can specify how you actually want to look up your own home directory. So you could create your own algorithm that does it, or something to that effect. But authentication and authorization support are fantastic because it means now that you can start working with different sets of user accounts. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to go ahead and do a quick demo on one of the extensibility providers that we're going to ship with it, which is our IIS Manager authentication. So if I switch back to my virtual PC, I have my different sites here, and one of the things that I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and remove my FTP site that I've been using for a couple of my demos, and I'm going to go back to using my default website, mainly because I think this makes a more realistic demonstration. And I'm going to go and add FTP publishing. So once again, I'm going to say I just want to allow SSL, and I'm going to turn on basic, say that I want to use the administrator account, and I'm going to turn on read or write. So same settings that you've seen me do before. Refresh my settings, so now you notice that all of my settings show up here. So just to show you logging in, let's make sure we get in and specify my password. And notice I see all my files here in the root of my default website. So one of the features that we have in IIS 7 is we have a new management service. And the great thing about the management service is that it actually allows you to, as an administrator, to delegate out the ability for remote users to connect to your IIS server and actually manage their own sites. So therefore they can make changes using a down-level administrator that looks pretty much like the administrator that you see here on Windows Server 2008, and they can make changes to their site. Well, there's two different ways that we can do this. You can say that you want to use Windows credentials, or you can use Windows credentials or IIS Manager credentials. And when you say you want to use IIS Manager credentials, this allows you to create virtual accounts that are not physical accounts on your box in order to allow people to manage their sites. Well, I'm going to go ahead and apply this. Now, in order to use the FTP IIS Managers, you just need to enable the ability Windows credentials or IIS Manager credentials. You don't need to actually start this, this management service. So I'm going to go ahead and skip over that. And if I go back down to my management section here, it says that I have manager users, and right now I don't have a user that's specified in here. So I'm going to come in here and say I want to add a user, and I'm going to call it, let's just say FTP user, and give him a password. And I have this user in here now. Now I'm going to go down to my default website. Way down at the bottom of my default website, I have this IIS Manager permissions setting. And in here, I can come in and say that I want to allow a user. And it's going to ask me to specify a Windows user or an IIS Manager user. Since I've enabled that feature, this shows up. I can come and I can select this FTP user and say, OK. So now this user could, if I had the management service running and I enabled remote connections, this user could log in using the remote IIS Manager and actually make changes to their site. And since they've only been added to the default website, they would never see any of my other sites over here. So they would not see Contoso or Fabricam or the SharePoint administration site. They wouldn't see any of these sites showing up in that management tool. They would only see the site that they've been given access to. Well, in this particular case, we added this user just so that we can come back and add them in using the IIS Manager authentication. So we need to make a couple of changes here to my FTP site. If we pull up authentication, we enabled basic authentication when we added FTP publishing to this site. What I want to do now is I actually want to add one of our custom providers. Now we're shipping to custom providers with the FTP7 server. We're shipping IIS Manager authentication, which is what I'm going to demo right now. We also ship ASP.NET authentication. And this allows you to add ASP.NET users to your actual permissions for your FTP site, meaning that you could set up forms authentication for your HTTP browsing and then allow the same user database to allow people to log in and edit the FTP site, or a different set of ASP.NET users. But in this particular case, I'm going to go with ASP.NET Manager authentication. And when I select that, now it shows up in my list of authentication providers, and it says that it's enabled, and it tells me that the type is custom. Now when I go to my authorization rules, I just have the one rule that I added as I went through the Add FTP Publishing wizard. What I need to do now is add a new rule, and I'm going to add for a specified user, and I'm going to add my FTP user in here, and I'm going to say he can have read and write. So now that I've applied that, I'm going to go ahead and log in to my site, put in FTP user. And it usually takes a second longer because it has to fire up the extensibility process. And now when I do a directory, it shows me all my files in the default website. So as I mentioned, there's that slight delay when it actually makes the connection initially, and that connection is just so that it can start the extensibility process that this authentication is going to run in. So our built-in providers, those actually run natively inside the FTP service. All of the extensibility that you do will actually run in an external process, and so that way we actually have a level of process isolation for security reasons. So, once again, this manager account that I created, this FTP user, if I enabled the remote management through the IIS Manager, this user could also log in and actually administrate this, the default website and also upload their content through FTP. So switching back to the presentation, what we've taken a quick look at is how we've used our own extensibility model for FTP7 to add an extensible authentication provider for IIS Manager authentication. So this is, once again, a really great story from a single point of management when you're thinking about IIS managers, because now an administrator can hand out these accounts, these IIS manager accounts. They're not physical accounts actually on their machine, but yet users can log in, upload content, and connect with the remote manager and actually manage their FTP site and our website and make all these changes, and you never have to give them a physical account on your box. So the next thing we talk about is improved logging and supportability. So first of all, from a logging perspective, we now log all of our verbs. In IIS 6 and earlier, the FTP service would only log a subset of the commands that were actually being used. So now when you take a look at your FTP 7 logs, you'll see that they're a whole lot more verbose. There's a lot of activity going on that was never logged before. So this allows you to do things like track break and attempts better and things like that. We also added additional detail fields. For example, the session IDs. In the past, with IIS 6 and earlier, we had a session ID, and when you looked in your FTP 7 logs, the session ID was just a one-up numbering from the last time that the service was started. So you'd start your FTP service, the next person who would connect would get session ID 1, the next person to connect would get session ID 2, and you could be up to, let's say, maybe session 50, and then you restarted your FTP service for some reason, and it starts back over numbering at session 1. So when you go to take a look at your logs, you may see that you had 20 different users who all got session 1. So essentially the session ID in the past was fairly useless. Well, in FTP 7, we've switched it over now, so session ID is now in a field all by itself. We actually use a GUID, and so if you're used to using something like log parser, you can simply do a very simple select query that does a count on the unique GUIDs that you see, and you can actually very easily generate reports that will come back and tell you like the number of unique user visits that you had during the day, etc. Another thing that we've added as an additional field is full path. So HTTP, whenever a request comes in, it's always passing the entire URL length on as part of the line coming in. So it'll always be like, get /directory1/directory2/mypage.asp. That would always show up in the logs. But in the case of FTP, it was more difficult because a person could log in and then say cd directory1, cd directory2, and then get mypage.asp. And you would actually have to walk backwards through your log to try to figure out which path that they were actually going to. Well, we've now added this new field which will show you the full path. So as the user is moving through the directory structure on your FTP site, we are building in memory that full path list, so at any time any operation happens, we'll show you the actual path that they did it on. So it makes it easier to track actually what a user is doing. From a supportability perspective, we have detailed local error messages, and I actually pointed that out when we were doing some of the SSL. Messages and how it was coming back and telling you verbosely, you have SSL required for the command channel, and you're trying to send things in the clear. So it helps log that down. And then last, we also have event tracing for Windows, which is extremely handy. I find myself using that an awful lot. You can just enable ETW tracing, reproduce a problem, and then come back and take a look at the ETW log. I tend to use log parser to parse the ETW files. So for those of you who are savvy with using a little bit of ETW tracing and also log parser, you can create yourself a very nice reporting feature where you can take a look at what was going on. And so we send a lot of very useful information to the ETW logs. So moving off from FTP 7, let's take a quick look at the front page server extensions and just basically talk about where we're going with these. So we're going to have Windows Server 2008 and Vista support. So currently, when you're installing Windows Server 2008, you have all these authoring tools that require front page server extensions, but it's not available, and that's because it's not shipping on the DVD. Once again, it'll be a download. But we are creating an updated version for Windows Server 2008. It will RTM around that time, and the support lifespan should be around the RTM of Windows Server 2008. Around 3 years after that is the support that we're doing for the front page server extensions at this point. Some of the things that we're doing a little differently, since we are retooling it just a little bit, we are changing it to where front page server extensions do not automatically install on the default website when you install the new package. So if you install FPSE in the past, you knew that it always installed directly to the default website. And now we've come back and said, okay, this isn't the best idea in the world. You probably don't want the server extensions on your default website, so we don't do that. Another great feature is there are dependencies that front page server extensions have. And when you're installing the front page server extensions, if any of those dependencies are missing, the front page server extension package can install those. So what it actually does is it gives you a huge big prompt, and it says, hey, these features are required, and you can choose to continue or you can cancel. But it'll actually tell you which features it's going to install. And then there are some optional features that it'll prompt you for as well. For example, active server pages are not required for the front page server extensions. But if you have people that are using like front page 2003 and they want to use the database interface wizard that comes with that, that uses classic ASP, or it can use classic ASP. So you can go ahead and install ASP at the time of installation as well. So our supported operating systems that we have Windows Server 2008. So we are supporting 32-bit completely. And then on 64-bit machines, what we're doing is we support the front page server extensions in 32-bit worker process mode. So we're not compiling native 64-bit front page server extensions for a 64-bit machine. Instead, we're taking the 32-bit extensions and porting those to the 64-bit machine and running them in a 32-bit worker process. Which, when you take a look at some of the hosting guidelines that Microsoft is putting out from a performance perspective, a lot of times running 32-bit worker process mode is more performant than 64-bit. It depends on which applications you're working with at the time. So, and lastly, apart from Windows Server 2008, we support these versions of Vista. We support Business, we support Enterprise, Ultimate, and Home Premium. One thing to call out is Home Premium actually doesn't have Windows integrated authentication. So when you're using Home Premium, you have to use basic authentication in order to do your authentication. That actually has nothing to do with front page. I just was pointing that out as an IIS feature. So next, let's take a look at WebDAV. So in Windows Vista and 2008, they have a great new WebDAV redirector, but we don't have a WebDAV module that ships with IIS out of the box. And this is because WebDAV was removed from IIS 7 early on in the product cycle, and then we started working on our new version of it. And like the FTP server, we simply just did not have enough time in order to get that onto the Longhorn ship cycle earlier on. So it's going to be RTM'd around the launch of Windows Server 2008, so you'll be able to download the WebDAV module and just install it on your IIS server and bring WebDAV functionality onto your box. So let's take a quick look at how WebDAV redirection works inside IIS 7 and Windows Server 2008. Let me switch back to my virtual PC. And let me go ahead and close this command prompt, or actually just exit out of FTP. Now if I go back to my FTP site, I'm going to go ahead and say I want to remove FTP publishing for this site altogether. So now I have no FTP publishing. So at this point, the only way that I could really get files to the server would be to sit physically at the box or to connect to it, let's say, using a UNC share or something like that. And let's take a quick look at my authentication methods. So I have Anonymous turned on, and I have Windows authentication turned on. So that will allow me to log in. So if I try to do a netuse command to localhost, okay, it comes up and tells me the network name cannot be found. It doesn't actually know what's going on here. So now if I go back to my default website and I go to my WebDAV authoring rules here, I have a choice here to actually enable WebDAV for my site. And at this point I can come in and add an authoring rule. And authoring rules are fairly similar to the authorization rules you saw me doing for FTP. I'm going to say I want to add for a specific user, administrator. And I'm going to say that the administrator has full rights in here. And I've added that. Oh, hang on a second here. Let me exit back out of here. And actually, let me, instead of trying to log in from here, let me actually show it from trying to do from the map network drive. Let me not say I want to reconnect from log on. And it's giving me an error here. Let me just do a quick cycle on IS here. Oops, I didn't spell reset correctly. An interesting thing, by the way, for those of you who are used to IS6, when you would do an IS reset in the past, you'd notice that whenever you brought in the administration tool, it would always tell you that it had disconnected and reconnected back to the server. But in this particular case with IS7, it doesn't do that because it's running separately. So, all right, I do have WebDAV enabled, and I have my different settings here, and those all look good. So let's try to connect in here again. All right, so normally don't need to restart the service for that, so I apologize. I'm not quite sure what that was. But now if I do a dir on Z, you notice it actually shows me all my files in here. So I've actually connected at this point using WebDAV and the redirector. And if I go ahead and take a look in Explorer, it shows me all my files in here. So there are various clients inside Microsoft that have WebDAV support. For example, the Expression Web Designer actually will connect to a WebDAV site. So, but it makes it pretty easy to actually just connect across the internet using the WebDAV redirector. One thing to point out about the WebDAV redirector, though, is that is an optional component. It is part of what is called the desktop experience. So when you're on a Windows server, like a Windows Server 2008 computer, it will not actually have the WebDAV redirector on there by default. You need to actually go enable it. Let's just go ahead and try to connect from Expression Web. And there you notice it just opened up that website using WebDAV. So this is great because it gives you HTTP-based publishing without having to use the front page server extensions. Switching back to the presentation. Just to recap, you saw me actually demo connecting with the WebDAV redirector. Slight glitch there, sorry about that. But then I was able to also show you how I could turn around and I could connect using a tool like Expression Web Designer. So in summary, the different things that we've taken a look at today, we are shipping the following items for Windows Server 2008. By the RTM, which first of all is the brand new FTP service that has all sorts of features loaded into it. SSL, IPv6, hostname support, user isolation. Just a lot of great features that are in there. And if you go to the is.net website, we have all sorts of walkthroughs that will lead you through administrating many of these features. We are shipping a feature-compatible version of the front page server extensions. And by feature compatible, it means that we're not adding any new functionality to the front page server extensions. We're just making sure that the same publishing parity that you had for Windows Server 2003 is still there in Server 2008. And next, we're shipping a brand new WebDAV implementation, which is based on the IS7 model infrastructure. So this is great because it makes it better supported going forward. And all of these are going to be downloadable from is7.net. Now, as I mentioned before, earlier in the presentation, you can download the beta version of the FTP7 server. Now this is actually a go-live release, so you can download and put that into production. And the same goes for the front page server extension. So you can download both of those, put those on your Windows Server 2008 RC0 computer, and you can be using that for web authoring. WebDAV, once again, will ship by end of the year in a public-facing go-live beta so that you'll be able to download it and start testing with it at that time. So some related content, as I just mentioned, you can download the FTP7 server and the front page server extensions from the is.net website. And if you get your hands on the presentation when we're done today, you'll be able to go to these URLs and pull these files down. As I also mentioned, we have a lot of walkthroughs that are available on is.net. Here's just a handful of the walkthroughs. I've written about 10 different walkthroughs for working with the new FTP7 server, and I'll keep adding them over time. Lastly, as a plug for is.net, there's a lot of great information up on is.net. We have all sorts of walkthroughs from various members of the product team. We have blogs where you can interact with members of the product team, and we have forums where the product team and our MVPs are actively engaged in answering questions. So, and lastly, we have our download center, which is where we're currently making our modules available for download, and also third-party companies can submit things for download from there. So more information, different places you can take a look at. Microsoft's TechNet website is the URL specified, and the is.net URLs that you see listed there. So there's a Microsoft Learning Training portal that you might want to take a look at. And once again, if you get your hands on the presentation when we're done, you can take a look at these different resources that we have there, by way of e-learning, books, different classroom training that we have, and hands-on labs. So we've just got a wealth of information that you might want to take a look at there. And now that we're at the question and answer phase, I will go ahead and turn things back over to Tracy.
Excellent. Thanks, Robert. I do want to remind everybody that for more information, they can print a PDF of today's session. To do that, you just want to go to the File menu in your upper navigation bar. Now is a good time to submit your questions into the Q&A panel. You just want to type them in and hit that Ask button. Also, I'm going to be posting a survey here in just a minute. If you would all please take a moment to fill that out before you log off. We do appreciate your feedback. As a reminder for upcoming and previously recorded webcasts, you'll want to visit Microsoft.com/webcasts. Now you can go here to access this webcast, which will be available for download in about 24 hours. And if you have any webcast content ideas, something out there you'd like to see and haven't yet, we'd love to hear from you. Just take note of this link here. And here's the survey from our session today. Please follow the links provided to complete today's webcast evaluation. And Robert, it looks like we have some questions waiting there for you.
Okay, hang on a second here. Let's pull up the question manager. Let's see. Can you do the reverse and add a website to an existing FTP site is one question. And the answer to that, actually, yes. All you really need to do at that point is simply just add an HTTP binding to an FTP site, and the site's hosting on both protocols. So yes, very, very easy to reverse the add FTP publishing to an HTTP site to add HTTP browsing to an FTP site. So yes, it is certainly possible to do that. The next question I have in here, is it possible to use a third-party SSO for authentication authorization, or can we support Kerberos? That was question number one from one user. In answer to that, you can actually write your own authentication provider that would do that sort of authentication. We do not have Kerberos support built in out of the box, but as you saw in the authentication demo, it's fairly easy to write your own provider and just plug it in, and then therefore you can do your own method of authenticating users and authorizing users. Then there's another question there about can you have multiple virtual hosts to the same site? And yes, you can have multiple virtual hosts to the same site. So easy answer on that one. There was a question about using an API for FSRM to determine the amount of space that the user is currently using. I'm actually not sure on that. Yeah, I'm not sure on that one. So I apologize, I don't have an answer. I don't know if Isaac is on the line, but I'll see if I can get an answer back on that later. Have another question here about will the FTPS command line client be available in older versions of Windows? Well, the FTPS client will just be a separate download. So it's not actually shipping with the FTP service itself. It's just it's a tool that we're going to make available for download. And I use it on Windows Server 2003 all the time. So it's just a command line tool, and so therefore it's pretty easy to call from anywhere. The great thing about it is since we just extended the command set from ftp.exe, it means that the scripts that you have that currently work with ftp.exe will work just as easily with ftps.exe, except that now you can embed a couple of extra commands in there to script SSL support. So hope that answers all of those questions. Then let's see, another question that we have in here is, let's see, will FTPS be built in let's see, built in for Visual Studio 2008. I think, if I understand the question correctly, I think the question is, will FTPS protocol support be built in with Visual Studio 2008? And if that is actually the question, then the answer to that, unfortunately, is no at this point. We've actually been working with the Visual Studio 2008 group, and their ship schedule was actually ahead of the FTPS service. And so even though we were able to make a version of the service available to them a while ago, we were not able to do it in a time where they were actually able to add native support for that. And the same actually holds true for WebDAV support for Visual Studio. But that being said, what you can actually do in the case of Visual Studio with WebDAV is you can actually map a drive, as you saw me do with the WebDAV redirector. You can map a drive, and then you can use Visual Studio to open it up, and Visual Studio will just think it's a local path. The redirector will take will do all the work for you for actually talking to WebDAV on your part. So I hope I understood the question correctly as far as FTPS support in Visual Studio 2008. The next question is, and this was from back when I did the user isolation demo. The question actually is, if you said no one would be able to log into FTP root, then why did I create a virtual directory to it? So let me answer that question. There's a couple of trailers onto this question, but I'd like to go ahead and answer that one first. So, so the reason, when we were working with user isolation, you have to create some sort of a path that is the first level of support. And actually, at this point, what I'm going to do, I should be able to still switch back. Can you still see the?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. So if we take a look back here in my Internet Services Manager, when you start creating a site and you want people to log into it for user isolation, you need to create a path. And actually what I'm going to do at this point, since I wrote the help file here, I'm going to actually just bring up the help file to show you something, because it actually gives an example on what you want to do. So if you take a look in here, it talks about how to actually create the hierarchies that you need for users to be able to log into. So it gives an example here for anonymous users. You would create, under your whatever your FTP root is, you would create a local user physical directory or virtual directory, depending on which mode you're using. And then you'd create a directory or virtual directory underneath there called public. Now in the specific case, what you saw me demonstrate is using a local Windows user account. So in this particular case, what I did is I created, under my FTP root, a local user virtual directory, and then I created a virtual directory for the username, which in my case was administrator. So you need to actually have this, this path in there, because if you're working with a local user account, you need to have a path for local user, or you need to have a path for user domain. But once again, no one will ever get into either one of these directories. You need to have an FTP root because the FTP service needs to point to a starting point. Then you need to have some sort of a delineating directory for where the user account is coming from. So if it's coming from the local SAM, it's going to go into the local user folder or virtual directory. And then if you're coming from a domain, it's going to go into whatever your domain name is. So if, say, a perfect example is if you have a local user administrator account and you have a domain name administrator account, which you have by default, you could actually have two virtual directories for administrator, but they have to go under the separate roots. So once again, these roots, no one actually logs into the root. It's just a delineating place in order to say where to go find the user's actual login information. So if I log in as the local administrator account, it'll pass me into, let's say it was c://inetpub/ftp root /local user /administrator, or c://inetpub/ftp root /my domain name /administrator. So that way it shows that the domain administrator will go under this path and the local user goes under there. But once again, no one actually gets to the actual local user or user domain path itself. I hope that answers the question. It takes a little bit of getting used to. Pretty much the same way that it worked in IIS 6. The only difference is that in IIS 7, we're working with virtual directories in combination with physical directories, but no one will ever be able to actually get into these root paths. I hope that makes sense and answers the question. So let me switch back to the question manager. There was another question about where did you specify deny permissions, and also where information about FTP is stored. So let me take the couple of things here. So first of all, what you saw me actually do was add allow rules in the FTP server. So if I switch back to my FTP server here, let me exit out of the help. And if you take a look under the authorization rules, we have allow rules and we have deny rules. So you could come in here and you could say that I want to deny all, anonymous users everything. So now anonymous users could never read or write to the site. Now, quite frankly, you never added anonymous users, so it's kind of a moot point at this point. But if you wanted to jump through that level of going ahead and denying that particular set of users this way, you could. So the other half of that question was, where are these settings actually kept? And these settings are actually kept in application host.config along with the rest of your settings. So just taking a quick look at that. For those of you who are used to IIS in the past, all of the settings were always kept in the metabase. And in IIS 7, I don't want to go really in depth in here in taking a look at application host.config because it's a big topic. And I want to get to some of the other questions. But all of your settings are actually kept in here. And so if we take a look at some of my different sites in here, notice that I've got, here's my default website, and I've got different bindings underneath here, and my Contoso website, and my Fabricam, and I've got basic allowed. And if I jump down to the bottom under my Fabricam site, notice I've got my allow and deny rules actually added under the location path for that. So those of you who are used to the metabase, you'll be happy to know it's gone away in this version. Application host.config is very easy to read. That is where all these settings are kept. It's fairly easy to get used to, and also for those of you who are scripting savvy, it makes it pretty easy to go ahead and actually script adding a bunch of rules like for site creation. So I hope that answers that question. And let me move on to the next question here. So there's a question about not seeing an FTP7 client on IIS.net. There actually isn't an FTP7 client on IIS.net. The FTP server is located under the downloads link. As a matter of fact, if you go to IIS.net and you click on the tab for downloads, down on the bottom for the most requested downloads, you'll see that the FTP7 server is the second most downloaded application right now on there. But the FTPS client that we're going to put out, that we actually haven't released that yet. So that's one of the things that we plan to do by launch. But we've been working more on the server thus far. So even though the client is done enough for me to do demos and stuff with, we want to run it through some more test passes before we actually put it out there and let people work with it. So hope that answers that question. There is a question about WebDAV's provider supporting Dazzle and hooking in to provide versioning capabilities. We do not have any sort of we do not have any of the search functionality that was there from the previous versions of WebDAV, and we also do not have it as being extensible for being able to provide something like versioning capabilities. Now, when we sat down and started designing this new WebDAV implementation, we took a look at versioning, and when we spec'd out the amount of time to actually create the module, we opted to hold off on doing the versioning at this point. So yeah, we don't have built-in versioning, and we don't have a way of actually doing the versioning capabilities built in. Now that being said, versioning actually is done through a series of other HTTP commands. It is theoretically possible then to write your own IIS-7 module that runs like in parallel or in tandem with WebDAV that actually provides support for the versioning commands. So we won't block another module from actually listening to those commands, but we do not have actually an extensibility point for you to work with. So I hope that answers that question. See, there was another question about the, let's see, there's another question about trace information for FTP usage. And by this, if the question means that if for FTP usage you mean like the FTP logs, then we keep them under the same root directory that the W3 service keeps their logs. So we've switched that from under System32 to where now by default logs are kept under c:\inetpub, or your system drive, inetpub, and then logs, and then there's a directory underneath there called log files. The reason why there's a logs directory under these is the failed request tracing logs for HTTP are also kept underneath there. So all of that usage information will all be logged under there. And like HTTP, we use W3C extended format logs. And so if you're used to parsing the log information, use something like log parser or something like that, you can do all of that easily there. There is another question about Visual Studio, about supporting FTPS. And actually what the person is doing is they're clarifying the fact that I answered the question about Windows Server 2008 having support for FTPS built in for publishing. And the point that somebody else is making is that if you're asking about .NET support for FTPS support, there is FTPS support built in for the FTP web class. Actually, that was one of the early tests that one of our developers did who's working on the new FTP7 service. He took this very same FTP web request class and built his own graphical FTP interface for uploading and downloading files. And he just did it all using that class. And so it's got really, really nice support for SSL support and a bunch of other things. So it's a good way of writing .NET code to be able to talk to the FTP7 server. Let's see. The next question that I have in here is, let's see. The person's asking, you mentioned that instead of switching to a different channel like an HTTP to port 443, in FTP you switch to SSL certificate by FTPS-P localhost. The FTPS-P localhost that's the command line parameter that you pass to it, the -P, which tells it to switch into protected mode, meaning it to go ahead and turn on SSL from the outset. So it's different in the sense of changing ports like you do from port 80 to port 443 to go from HTTP to HTTPS. This just basically is telling it as part of its connection, when it goes to connect to the server, go ahead and negotiate SSL first before doing anything else. Because typically when you connect with an FTP client, you go straight for authentication. So you make the connect, you do your user, you do your pass command, and you connect to the server. In this case, what it does is it embeds all the SSL commands to negotiate that. So the command line switch that we added for the FTPS command is just to try to make it easier to go straight to SSL, which is extremely handy when you want to connect to a server using the command line tools. Because as you saw, the server, once you tell it that you want to connect, if you did like an FTP localhost and it had the policy turned on, it would go straight for the policy turned on for SSL, that is, to require. It would immediately go for trying to prompt you for the username. And so the first thing that you would get back is this error message telling you that you can't actually connect because the SSL policy requires SSL being negotiated first. So I hope that answers the question. It's not switching to a different channel. It's all taking place over the same command channel. We're just telling it to go ahead and send the commands across the wire first to go ahead and negotiate SSL before working with the username and password. So I think that's all the questions that I have. So the one question that for FSRM, I'll go ahead and I'll try to follow up with the gentleman that asked that question. And that's actually all the questions that we have. So, Tracy?
All right, and with that, I do want to extend a very special thank you to Robert for your presentation today and for answering all the great questions that he had come through the queue. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to conclude today's session. I want to thank you again for joining us. You may now disconnect from the audio portion of today's presentation.